Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight we slip back nearly 9 centuries into a world of damp stone flickering torchlight, and the kind of family arguments that get settled with castles and cavalry rather than a strongly worded letter. You are about to meet a baby who will grow into one of the most famous warrior kings who ever lived. A man so wrapped in legend that his actual heartbeat gets lost beneath the roar of the crowd. Right now, though, he is small, red-faced, and squalling in a cradle, utterly unaware that history has already drawn a sword and handed it to him. Fair warning, if you had been born into this particular royal household with this particular set of relatives, you probably would not survive the dinner table politics, let alone the wars. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. While you settle in, tell me down in the comments where you are listening from and what the local time is, because I love imagining all of you scattered across the dark, sleepy globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in the city of Oxford in the autumn of the year 1157, and the air smells of wood smoke and wet straw. Somewhere inside a royal residence called Beaumont Palace, a queen has just given birth to her third son, and you can hear the muffled commotion of attendants hurrying through cold corridors. The child is named Richard, and you have absolutely no idea yet how loudly that name will echo. He is the son of King Henry II of England and Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, which is a bit like being born to 2 thunderstorms who happen to be married. You lean closer to the cradle and the infant blinks up at the ceiling, unimpressed, as babies tend to be by the weight of destiny. Here is the mainstream fact you should carry with you tonight. Richard was not born to rule a tidy little island. He was born into something historians call the Angevin Empire, a sprawling patchwork of lands that stretched from the misty borders of Scotland all the way down through western France to the warm edges of the Pyrenees. You can picture it as a vast, awkward quilt stitched together by marriage, inheritance, and stubbornness. His father controlled more of France than the actual King of France did, which, as you might imagine, was the sort of thing that did not make for cozy neighbourly relations. Now for the quirky little tidbit, the kind you can whisper to someone tomorrow to sound mysteriously well read. Despite ruling England and being one of its most celebrated kings, Richard almost certainly spoke very little English at all. His native tongue was a form of French, and the cultured language of his mother's homeland, the language of poets and troubadours. So the great English hero, the lion-hearted symbol of the nation, would have struggled to order a meal in a Yorkshire tavern. You find that delightful and slightly absurd, and you are right to. You drift through the early days of his life, and you notice immediately that this is not a household built for warmth. His mother, Eleanor, is one of the most extraordinary women of the entire medieval world. Before she married Henry, she had been Queen of France, married to a different king entirely, and she had even travelled on crusade herself, riding east toward the Holy Land in a swirl of legend that scandalized the chroniclers. The stories about her grew so wild that people whispered she had ridden bare-shouldered like a warrior goddess to inspire the troops. And historians still argue whether any of those colourful rumours held a grain of truth, or whether they were simply the medieval version of tabloid gossip aimed at a powerful woman who refused to behave. You suspect the truth is duller and the legend is more fun, which is usually how these things go. You watch the baby grow into a small boy, and you begin to understand the strange machinery of inheritance that surrounds him. They are pieces on a board, assets to be married, off-regions to be governed, threats to be managed. Richard has an older brother, Henry the Young King, who is being groomed for England, and another sibling arrangement is already forming in the back of his parents' calculating minds. Richard, almost from the cradle, is being mentally assigned to his mother's beloved southern lands, the rich and rebellious Duchy of Aquitaine. You realise with a small shiver that he is being raised not as a person, but as a future ruler of a specific troublesome place, and that everything tender about childhood will be sanded down to make room for everything useful about power. You wander the cold halls and you feel the absence of stability. This is a family that moves, constantly dragging its court across the sea and over endless muddy roads, because a medieval king has to be seen everywhere, to be obeyed anywhere. There is no single home, no quiet nursery wall to measure his height against. There is only motion and ambition and the low hum of adults plotting. You begin to suspect that a boy raised entirely in motion, entirely amid conflict, might grow into a man who only ever feels at home when something is happening, when there is a campaign to plan or an enemy to face. Hold that thought, because it will matter enormously by the end of our story. And so you stand there in the torchlight, watching the small future Lionheart sleep the empire, breathing around him like a great restless animal. The seeds of everything, the glory and the bloodshed and the legend, are already planted in this ordinary, extraordinary nursery. You are only at the very beginning, and already you can feel how heavy this small life is going to become. You follow the small boy out of that drafty Oxford nursery and onto the road, because in this family the road is practically a second home. Remember how I said this was a court built on motion rather than comfort? You are about to feel exactly what that means in your feet, because young Richard spends his childhood being carried, ridden, and sailed back and forth across a stretch of grey, heaving water that nobody crosses for fun. The English Channel in the 12th century is not a relaxing ferry ride with a snack trolley. It is a cold, sickening gamble, and you can almost taste the salt and the fear as the royal household bundles itself onto creaking ships again and again, chasing the endless business of ruling lands on two sides of the sea. You watch him grow up, split down the middle, half a creature of the misty north and half a creature of the sunlit south. England gives him reign, politics, and a treasury. His mother's homeland gives him something far more seductive. You drift southward with him into Aquitaine, where the light turns golden, the wine flows, and the air practically hums with poetry. This is the heartland of the troubadours, the wandering singer-poets who turn longing and love into elaborate art. And the court of Eleanor is one of the great fountains of that culture. You find young Richard soaking it up like a sponge that happens to be wearing a small sword. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight, and it is one that surprises people who only picture Richard as a grim man in armor. He was genuinely cultured and musically gifted. He could compose poetry and song in the elegant, courtly traditions of the South, and he grew up steeped in the refined world of his mother, rather than only the muddy battlefields of his father. You picture this enormous future warrior carefully working out the rhythm of a love lyric, and it rearranges your whole image of him, doesn't it? The Lionheart, it turns out, could carry a tune. Now lean in for the quirky little tidbit. There survives, even today, a poem widely believed to have been written by Richard himself, composed later in his life during a very dark moment we will reach much further along. It is a genuine piece of royal songwriting, a king pouring out his frustration in verse, which means that one of the most fearsome soldiers of the medieval age also has, technically, a recorded discography. You enjoy imagining the playlist. One sword, one crown, one melancholy ballad. But do not let the music fool you into thinking this is a gentle upbringing. You watch the seeds of something harder being planted right alongside the poetry. This is a household where everyone is quietly measuring everyone else, where loyalty is a currency that fluctuates by the hour. Richard's parents, those two married thunderstorms, are drifting apart in slow and dangerous ways, and a clever child absorbs the temperature of a room long before he understands the words being spoken in it. You sense him learning very young that affection and ambition are tangled together, and that even the people who love you may one day need you to be on the opposite side of a war. You wander with him through the great fortresses of the South, and you notice how often the lessons are not about books but about control. He is being shaped to govern Aquitaine, a region famous for its proud, prickly, fiercely independent nobles who regard the idea of obeying anyone as a personal insult. To rule them, a boy must learn to be charming, ruthless, and absolutely unflinching. Sometimes within the same afternoon, you realize that his classroom is the duchy itself, and the curriculum is power. Historians still argue whether Eleanor deliberately raised Richard to favour her southern lands and her own interests above his father's grand northern empire, planting in him a loyalty that would later split the family apart. Some see a calculating mother grooming her favourite son as an instrument of her own ambitions. Others see a simpler story of a boy who naturally bonded with the warmer, brighter world where he spent his happiest years. You will not settle that debate tonight, and frankly neither will the scholars, but you can feel the tension humming underneath it like a string about to be plucked. You also begin to notice the brothers, that quarrelsome brood we will properly meet next time. They are growing up in the same atmosphere of shifting alliances, each one being handed a region, a title, a slice of the family pie, and each one quietly resenting the slices given to the others. You watch them circle each other at feasts, all polished manners and sharp eyes, and you think to yourself that this is less a family and more a very well-dressed standoff. Somebody is always being promised something, and somebody is always feeling cheated, and the man at the center of it all, their formidable father, seems to believe he can keep every plate spinning forever through sheer force of will. You feel the cold creep back into the story as the household swings north again, back across that wretched channel, back into the rain. Richard is no longer a squalling infant. He is a watchful boy, now fluent in the languages of charm and suspicion, comfortable with a horse and a hunting party, and the rhythms of a court that never stops moving. Hard around the edges, restless, most alive when something is happening. Remember that restlessness, because it will define every single year of his reign. And so the borders keep splitting his young life in two, the grey sea and the golden vineyards, the treasury and the troubadours, the father's empire and the mother's heart. You stand at the edge of his childhood, and you can feel the storm gathering not on the horizon but inside the very walls of his own home. The poetry is real, and the talent is real, but so is the danger. And you sense that very soon this gifted, watchful boy will have to choose a side in a war that no child should ever have to fight. You step now into the full storm of that family. The one I promised you was less a household and more a very well-dressed standoff. Remember those brothers circling each other at feasts with polished manners and sharp eyes. Tonight you get to watch the manners fall away entirely. At the centre of it all sits the father, Henry II, and you really ought to understand him before the shouting starts, because he is one of the most formidable rulers England ever produced, and also, it must be said, one of the most exhausting men to be related to. You picture Henry as a coiled spring in human form. He is restless, brilliant, and almost terrifyingly energetic, the kind of king who rides so fast and so far that his own courtiers can barely keep up, who works through meals, who reshapes the laws of England with one hand while juggling a sprawling continental empire with the other. Here is your mainstream fact to hold on to. Henry II was a genuine legal revolutionary, laying down foundations of English common law and the jury system that astonishingly still echo in courtrooms today. So the next time you imagine a jury, you can quietly thank this furious pacing medieval king who never sat still long enough to enjoy any of it. But all that brilliance came wrapped around a fatal flaw, and you can feel it as you watch him with his sons. Henry could conquer territory, write laws, and out-argue bishops, but he could not, for the life of him, let go of power. He dangled crowns and titles in front of his boys, like a man teasing dogs with a bone he had no intention of dropping. The eldest young Henry was actually crowned king during his father's own lifetime, an extraordinary move, and yet given almost no real power to go with the title. You can imagine how that felt. Picture being handed the keys to a magnificent car and then being told sternly that you are absolutely not allowed to start the engine. Now for your quirky tidbit, and it is a strange and rather wonderful one. That eldest son became known to history as Henry the Young King, and he holds the peculiar distinction of being a crowned and anointed king of England who never actually reigned, never sat on the throne in his own right, and predeceased his father entirely. There are official lists where you will and will not find him, depending on who is counting a king-shaped gap in the record, a ghost wearing a crown. You find that quietly haunting a man remembered chiefly for a throne he was promised but never allowed to truly hold. You turn now to the mother Eleanor, whom you met among the troubadours in the golden light of the south. By this point in the story, her marriage to Henry has curdled into something cold and dangerous. The affection, whatever there once was, has been replaced by rivalry, resentment, and a fierce maternal determination to secure her son's inheritances, particularly the inheritance of her favourite your Richard. You sense her presence behind the boys, like a current pulling them in a particular direction away from their father and toward open defiance. And so the great quarrel begins to take shape, and you can feel it building like pressure behind a dam. 3 of the sons, young Henry, Richard, and their brother Geoffrey, grow more and more frustrated with a father who will not loosen his grip. They are men now, or nearly men, hungry for the real power they have been promised and denied. They look at their aging father still pacing, still controlling, still refusing to share, and something inside them hardens into rebellion. You watch them being courted too by the one man in the world most delighted to see this family tear itself apart. Across the border sits the King of France, the rival who has spent years watching the Angevin Empire swallow more and more of what he considers his rightful realm. He whispers to the sons, he flatters them, he offers them refuge and support and a sympathetic ear, because nothing weakens a powerful enemy like a civil war fought among his own children. You realize that the brothers are not only fighting their father, they are being used as pieces in a much larger game, exactly as they themselves were raised to be pieces. The cruelty of it has a certain symmetry. Historians still argue whether Eleanor was the true architect of the great rebellion that followed, deliberately turning her sons against their father, or whether she simply gave her blessing to a revolt the boys were already racing toward, on their own. Was she the puppet master pulling every string from the shadows of the South? Or a mother who chose her children's side when the family finally fractured? The chroniclers, who were rarely kind to powerful women, tended toward the dramatic version. You may make up your own mind, but I suspect as ever the truth lives somewhere in the messy middle. What you cannot doubt is the bitterness of it. This is a family in which love and warfare have become completely indistinguishable, where a father can crown his son one year and besiege him the next, where a mother can plot against the man she married, where brothers can stand shoulder to a shoulder against their own father, and then in time turn on one another. You watch the warmth you saw in those southern courts curdle entirely into something armoured and grim. The poetry is still there somewhere underneath, but the music has been drowned out by the clatter of gathering troops. And young Richard, your Richard, stands right in the heart of it. No longer a watchful boy, a young man now armed, ambitious, and ready to draw his sword against the man who gave him life. You feel the ground shifting beneath the whole empire, that great restless animal beginning to thrash. The standoff is over, the talking is nearly done, and as the torches gutter and the household splits down bloodlines that should have bound it together, you sense that the first true war of Richard's life is about to begin, fought not against strangers in some distant land, but against his own flesh and blood. You leave the poisoned feasts and the family plotting behind for a moment, because before Richard can ride against his own father in earnest, he has to learn how to ride against anyone at all. And so you follow the young man south again, back into that golden prickly duchy of Aquitaine we keep returning to, the land of vineyards and troubadours, and noblemen who would rather swallow their own swords than bow to a teenager. Remember how I said ruling those proud southern barons was his real classroom? Well, school is now fully in session, and the lessons are written in dust, sweat, and the smell of horses. You find Richard barely into his teenage years formally installed as Duke of Aquitaine, which sounds magnificent until you realize what it actually means. It means being handed authority over some of the most rebellious, independent-minded nobles in all of Europe. Men who treat the idea of obedience as a quaint suggestion from a child they have no intention of taking seriously. You can almost hear them chuckling behind their castle walls. A boy duke, how adorable. They will not be chuckling for long. Here is your mainstream fact to carry tonight. Richard proved himself a genuinely gifted military commander, astonishingly young while still in his teens, leading campaigns to crush rebellious barons across Aquitaine and earning a fearsome reputation long before he ever became king. This was not a man who stumbled into warfare later in life. He was forged in it from boyhood. And by the time most young men today are deciding what to study, Richard was already directing sieges and bending hardened warriors to his will. You watch him ride through those vineyards, and you notice that he does not lead from a comfortable distance. He throws himself into the thick of it, which both impresses his men and quietly terrifies them, because a commander who fights like he has nothing to lose is exhilarating right up until the moment he gets himself killed. The barons who scoffed at the boy duke discover, fortress by fortress, that this particular boy has an unnerving talent for showing up under their walls with an army and a very patient expression. He learns the grim arithmetic of siege warfare early, the cutting of supplies, the slow squeeze the moment a defender's resolve finally cracks. Now lean in for your quirky tidbit, because it explains the name that history would eventually hang on him. Even in these early campaigns, Richard developed a reputation for a kind of ferocious, almost theatrical courage that bordered on the reckless. The famous nickname the Lionheart, the Lion-Hearted One, grew out of exactly this quality, a fearlessness in battle so pronounced that it seemed less like a strategy and more like a force of nature. You find it funny in a dark way that the legend was already writing itself, while the man was still essentially a youth, as though history had decided on his brand before he had finished growing. But do not let the glory blind you to the cost, because there is always a cost, and the chroniclers do not flinch from it. Crushing rebellion in the 12th century did not mean a stern lecture and a handshake. It meant burning, plundering, and breaking the will of regions that refused to submit. The proud southern lords learned to fear him precisely because he was willing to be merciless, and a duchy that had laughed at a boy soon spoke his name with a wary respect that bordered on dread. You feel a little chill at how quickly the gifted, music-loving child of those troubadour courts hardened into something formidable and frightening. You also begin to see the pattern that will define his entire life take shape right here. Richard, it turns out, is happiest, most focused, most fully himself when there is a war to fight. Remember that restless boy raised entirely in motion, the one I told you would only ever feel at home when something was happening? Here he is, exactly as predicted. A young man who finds in the chaos of campaign a clarity he never seems to find in the quiet of a court. Governing in peacetime bores him. Warfare focuses him. You sense that this is both his greatest strength and the seed of everything that will eventually go wrong. Historians still argue whether Richard's early ruthlessness in Aquitaine made him a brilliant ruler in training, or simply a talented destroyer who never learned the harder art of holding a peace together. Was he forging the skills that would later make him a legend, or was he learning all the wrong lessons mastering conquest while never bothering to master contentment? The same campaigns that earned him glory also sowed lasting resentment among the very people he was supposed to one day rule, and you can already feel the contradiction at the heart of him. You ride beside him through one more dusty valley, watching him direct his men with a confidence that no 15 or 16-year-old has any business possessing. The southern sun beats down. The vineyards stretch in their orderly green rows, and somewhere in a captured fortress, a defeated baron is grudgingly admitting that the boy he laughed at has turned out to be the most dangerous young man in the duchy. You feel the legend hardening around him like a second suit of armor, and yet as you watch him triumph, you cannot quite forget where all this skill is heading. Every siege he masters, every rebellion he crushes, every lesson in war he absorbs is preparing him, not for some distant, glorious crusade, not yet, but for something far more intimate and far more painful. He is becoming a weapon, and very soon, that weapon is going to be turned around and aimed straight back at the man who placed the sword in his hand in the first place. The young warlord has learned his trade, the skills are sharpened, and the family war we have been circling all this time is about to explode into the open, with Richard no longer a boy at the edge of it, but a fully formed soldier riding straight into its heart. You arrive now at the moment everything we have been circling finally tears open, the moment the well-dressed standoff becomes an actual war. Remember that weapon I told you Richard was becoming, the one about to be turned back on the very man who handed him the sword. Tonight you watch it swing. The young warlord of Aquitaine, fresh from crushing his own rebellious barons, now rides against a far more dangerous target, his father, the formidable old king himself. You feel the strangeness of it settle over you like cold fog. There is something deeply unnatural about a son taking up arms against his father, and yet in this family, raised on shifting loyalties and dangled crowns, it almost feels inevitable. The brothers, those quarrelsome siblings we met circling the feast tables, have finally had enough of Henry II and his refusal to loosen his grip on real power. Young Henry, the crowned but powerless eldest, Geoffrey, the cunning middle son, and Richard, your Richard, the most militarily gifted of them all. Together they turn on their father, and the King of France, ever delighted, fans the flames from the sidelines, like a man pouring oil onto a fire he started. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight, and it is a sobering one. The Great Rebellion against Henry II was not a single clean uprising, but a long, grinding series of revolts that flared up across years, drawing in not only his sons, but his own wife Eleanor, and a host of opportunistic nobles eager to see the mighty Angevin Empire stumble. This was civil war on a continental scale, and it pitted a family against itself with a bitterness that the chroniclers struggled to fully capture. You watch Richard throw himself into the fight, with the same ferocity he showed in Aquitaine, except now the stakes are unbearably personal. He fortifies castles, he raises troops, he rides hard across contested territory, and you can see in him a man who has at last found a war worthy of all that restless energy. And yet beneath the soldier's focus you sense something more complicated, because this is not some distant enemy he is fighting. This is the man who named him, raised him, shaped him into exactly the kind of warrior now galloping against him. The irony is so sharp it could draw blood. Now lean in for your quirky tidbit, because the human details of this war are stranger than any legend. Eleanor herself, the brilliant queen, tried to slip away to join her rebelling sons, reportedly disguised in men's clothing, to evade her husband's agents as she rode toward the safety of the French court. The disguise failed. She was captured, and Henry, unwilling to be openly cruel to a queen but unwilling to forgive her, simply locked her away. You sit with that image for a moment, a queen of two kingdoms, a crusader, a patron of poets, caught fleeing in disguise and then quietly imprisoned by her own husband. The romance of the troubadour courts has curdled into something out of a tragedy. And here is the detail that will break your heart a little, the thing that gives this whole grim chapter its weight. Eleanor's imprisonment was not a matter of weeks or months. Henry kept her confined in varying conditions and various locations for the better part of 16 long years. 16 years. You let that number sink in. The woman who shaped Richard's love of poetry in the South, the mother who likely encouraged him toward this very rebellion, vanished from active life into a long captivity that would only end when Henry himself was gone. You feel the cost of the family war settling onto the women and children caught inside it. The fighting itself ebbs and flows in the maddening way of medieval warfare, all sieges and skirmishes, and negotiated pauses rather than grand decisive clashes. Henry, even besieged by his own blood, proves devastatingly capable, moving with that famous restless speed, outmaneuvering his sons again and again, refusing to break. There are reconciliations, hollow and temporary, where the sons bow and beg forgiveness, and Henry grants it, and then inevitably the resentments fester and the war flares back to life. You begin to understand that this is not a single rebellion, but a wound that simply refuses to close. Historians still argue whether Richard and his brothers were genuine victims of a tyrannical, controlling father who drove them to revolt, or spoiled and impatient princes who could not wait for their inheritance and tore the empire apart, out of pure ambition. Were they fighting for justice or merely for power they had not yet been given? The chroniclers watching it all unfold could hardly decide themselves, and you will find sympathy and condemnation tangled together in nearly every account. The truth, as always in this family, refuses to sit comfortably on either side. You watch the years grind on, and you notice how the rebellion reshapes Richard. He emerges from it not chastened but hardened, more confident, more independent, increasingly the master of his own southern domains, regardless of what his father wishes. Even when the formal revolts subside, the tension never truly does. Richard holds Aquitaine with an iron grip and a wary eye turned always toward the man who still wears the crown he intends one day to wear himself. And then tragedy begins to thin the ranks. Young Henry, the crowned king who never reigned the ghost in the royal lists we spoke of, falls ill during one of these endless conflicts and dies suddenly and shockingly while still in rebellion. You feel the whole family lurch. With the eldest gone, the entire careful, brutal arithmetic of inheritance shifts, and Richard finds himself moved into the position of heir to the throne of England itself. The war has rearranged everything, swallowing a brother and reshuffling a kingdom. You stand at the edge of all this exhaustion and grief. The empire scarred the queen, imprisoned a son in the grave, and the old king still grimly clinging to power as his remaining children circle ever closer. You sense that the long conflict between Henry and his sons is grinding toward its final bitter act. The crown Richard has wanted his whole life is closer now than ever, and it will reach him when it finally does, soaked in sorrow and bought at a price that no amount of glory will ever quite manage to repay. You come now to the end of the old king, and I want you to slow your breathing for this one, because for all the bitterness we have waded through, the death of Henry II is a genuinely sorrowful thing to witness. Remember how I told you the crown would reach Richard soaked in sorrow and bought at a terrible price? This is where that price comes due. and you can almost feel the weight of it pressing down on the warm summer air of France. By now, the long family war has worn everyone down to the bone. Young Henry, the crowned king who never reigned, is already in his grave. Geoffrey, the cunning middle brother, has also died, killed in a tournament accident, trampled in the chaos of the very kind of mock warfare these men loved a little too much. So, the brood that once circled the feast tables has been thinned to 2 surviving sons who matter most for our story. Richard, your Richard, now the eldest, living heir, and the youngest. A quiet, watchful young man named John, about whom you will hear a great deal more before our tale is done. Keep an eye on John. He has a talent for being exactly where the trouble is. You find Henry II in his final campaign, old now and ill, that famous restless energy finally failing him. And here is the cruelest turn of all. Richard, still distrustful of a father who would never share power, has allied himself once again with the King of France, and together they hound the dying king across his own territories. You watch Henry, the brilliant lawgiver, the man who once outtrode and outmaneuvered everyone, reduced to a sick and exhausted figure, being chased through the summer heat by his own son. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight, and it carries a real sting. Henry II was ultimately forced into a humiliating surrender, compelled to accept harsh terms and to formally recognize Richard as his heir, all while gravely ill and abandoned by nearly everyone. The mighty empire builder, the man who had controlled more of France than the French king himself, ended his life cornered. Beaten and broken not on a foreign field, but by his own flesh and blood. Now lean in for the tidbit that the chroniclers love to dwell on, the detail that turned a political defeat into a genuine tragedy. As the dying Henry was given the list of nobles who had betrayed him and gone over to Richard and the French, he asked to hear the very first name on it. And the name read aloud was that of John, his youngest son, the boy he had loved best, the one he had trusted most. They say the revelation broke whatever spirit the old king had left. Whether the story is literally true or simply too perfect for the chroniclers to resist, you feel its terrible weight. The father who could not share power with his children died learning that even his favourite had abandoned him. You stand at the deathbed now in the castle of Chinon in the warm dark of summer in the year 1189. Henry, the second King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, master of a sprawling empire, dies feverish and defeated, surrounded by far too few of the people who should have loved him. And just like that, the crown that has hovered over our entire story finally, irrevocably, falls to Richard. There is a legend attached to this moment, and I have to share it with you because it is so vivid that it has clung to the story for centuries. They say that when Richard came to view his father's body, the dead king's nose began to bleed as though the corpse itself were accusing its son. The old belief being that a murdered or wronged man's body would bleed in the presence of the one responsible for his death. Historians still argue whether this gruesome detail is genuine reportage or a piece of moralizing legend invented to dramatize Richard's guilt, but either way, it tells you everything about how this transfer of power was remembered. Not as a triumph, as a haunting. You watch something shift in Richard in these moments. For all his rebellion, for all the years of war against his father, there are signs that the reality of Henry's death struck him harder than he expected. The man he had fought his whole life was suddenly permanently gone, and with him went the only opponent who had ever truly tested him, the towering figure against whom Richard had defined himself since boyhood. You sense a strange hollowness beneath the victory, the disorientation of a son who has finally won a war he is no longer entirely sure he wanted to win. But Richard is not a man to linger in grief, and the machinery of kingship grinds forward whether he is ready or not. One of his very first acts as the new king is to order the release of his mother Eleanor from the 16 long years of captivity we spoke of, the imprisonment that began when she fled in disguise to join her rebelling sons. You feel the poetic justice of it. The queen who shaped him, who may well have set him on the path to this very throne, walks free at last, restored to power and honour, ready to help govern the empire her son has inherited. Out of all that bitterness, one genuine reunion of love. And so, in the summer of 1189, the legend steps fully onto the stage. Richard, the gifted child of the troubadour courts, the teenage warlord of Aquitaine, the rebellious son hardened by years of family warfare, is now King Richard the First of England. Everything he has ever wanted is finally in his grasp. The empire is his, the crown is his. The power his father would never share is his at last. You might expect him now to settle into the long, patient work of ruling England, to learn its towns and its people, to build a reign on the foundations his brilliant father laid. But Richard, as you are about to discover, has something else entirely burning in his heart. He has barely warmed the throne before his restless eyes turn away from England altogether toward a distant horizon, toward a holy obsession that will swallow nearly every year of his reign. The king has come home at last, and he can hardly wait to leave. You watch the new king crowned at last, and now I want to puncture a little myth that probably lives somewhere in the back of your mind. When you picture Richard the Lionheart, King of England, you likely imagine a man devoted to England, ruling from England beloved across the green hills of his island realm. Prepare to have that gently dismantled, because the truth is one of the great ironies of his entire reign, and remember how I just told you he could hardly wait to leave. Tonight you find out exactly how serious I was. You begin with the coronation itself in September of the year 1189 at Westminster Abbey, a ceremony of enormous splendour. Here is your mainstream fact to carry through the dark. Richard's coronation was a magnificent, carefully staged affair that helped cement many of the rituals of English kingship, and it remains one of the most thoroughly documented coronations of the medieval period. You can almost smell the incense and hear the great Latin chants rolling through the abbey as the crown settles onto his head and the new king is anointed before God and his nobles. But here is the darker tidbit attached to that same glittering day, and it casts a long shadow you should not look away from. The coronation was followed by a horrific outbreak of violence against the Jewish community of London, sparked by rumours and mob frenzy on the very day of celebration, spreading afterward to other English towns. Richard himself had reportedly tried to bar Jewish leaders from the ceremony, and the bloodshed that followed was a genuine atrocity, one of the grimmest episodes to mark the start of any English reign. You feel the cold contrast between the golden ritual and the terror in the streets, and it reminds you that the medieval world's splendour always sat uncomfortably close to its cruelty. Now, with the crown secured, you might expect Richard to roll up his sleeves and learn the business of ruling his new kingdom. Instead, you watch him do something that still astonishes historians. He treats England almost from the very first day not as a beloved homeland, but as something far more practical and far less romantic. He treats it as a treasury, well-stocked resource to be shaken upside down for every coin it holds, all in service of a single burning obsession we will reach very soon. Here is the fact that truly captures it, and it is genuinely staggering. Across his entire 10-year reign as King of England, Richard spent only a matter of months actually present in the country. By most reckonings, he set foot in England for roughly 6 months total across a decade on the throne. You let that sink in for a moment. The most famous warrior king in English history, the lion-hearted symbol of the nation, the face on 1,000 statues and storybooks, barely visited the place he ruled. And remember, this is the man who, as we learned long ago in those golden southern courts, probably could not even speak much English. He had no deep love for the rainy island, no sentimental attachment to its towns and villages. To Richard, raised between borders and most at home on campaign, England was wealthy, stable, and conveniently far from the action, which made it perfect for exactly one purpose: funding his ambitions elsewhere. You can almost picture him surveying his new kingdom the way you might survey a particularly full wallet, with satisfaction rather than affection. You watch him set about extracting that wealth with ruthless efficiency. He needs money, mountains of it, more money than perhaps any English king had ever assembled at once, and he is utterly unsentimental about how he raises it. Offices, lands, titles, privileges, all of it goes up for sale to whoever can pay in a great fire sale of royal assets that we will explore in more detail very soon. The kingdom becomes a machine for generating coin, and Richard turns its handle without hesitation. There is a famous remark attributed to him from around this time, a line so brazen that it has echoed down the centuries. He is said to have declared that he would have sold London itself if only he could have found a buyer. Historians still argue whether Richard actually spoke those exact cheeky words, or whether the quote was polished and sharpened by later writers eager to capture his attitude, but true or not, it perfectly distills the spirit of the man. London, the jewel of his English crown, was to him not a treasure to be cherished, but merchandise to be liquidated if the price were right. You might find yourself feeling a little indignant on England's behalf, and you would not be alone. And yet here is the strange part. By the standards of medieval kingship, this approach was not necessarily a failure. England under Richard remained largely well governed in his absence, run by capable administrators, its laws and its taxes flowing smoothly, precisely because the systems his brilliant father had built were strong enough to function without a king physically present. In a peculiar way, Richard's neglect was a backhanded compliment to Henry II's legacy. The machine ran fine without its driver. But that absence would also leave a dangerous vacuum, and you can already sense the trouble gathering in it. With the king perpetually away, ambitious men would be tempted to grasp at power left unattended. And one ambitious man in particular, that quiet, watchful youngest brother John, whom I told you to keep an eye on, would find an absent king a very convenient thing indeed. The seeds of future betrayal are being planted right here in the simple fact that Richard cared far more about leaving England than about staying to guard it. You step back and take in the whole strange picture. A king crowned in splendor amid bloodshed, a ruler who barely speaks his subjects' language, a monarch who treats his kingdom as a purse to be emptied all so that he can chase a dream that has nothing to do with England at all. Every coin he wrings from the land, every office he sells, every privilege he auctions is being gathered toward one single overwhelming purpose. The purpose that will define and consume his entire reign. And to understand that purpose, you must follow Richard's gaze away from the rainy island across the whole of Christendom, all the way to a distant holy city shimmering in the eastern heat. You follow Richard's gaze now away from rainy England and its overflowing treasury, all the way across the known world to a city that shimmers like a fever dream in the imagination of every Christian in Europe. Remember that single burning obsession I kept teasing, the purpose that would swallow his entire reign. Here it finally is out in the open at last. Its name is Jerusalem. And to understand the grip it held on Richard, you have to understand the storm of emotion sweeping across Christendom in these years. You step back a little to see the wider picture, because Richard did not invent this dream. For nearly a century before him, waves of armed pilgrims had marched east in what we now call the Crusades, religious wars aimed at seizing and holding the lands Christians considered most sacred, above all, the holy city of Jerusalem itself. The First Crusade, generations earlier, had stunned the world by actually capturing the city, carving out fragile Christian states along the eastern Mediterranean coast. For decades, against all odds, those states clung on. And then came the earthquake that set everything in our story in motion. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight. In the year 1187, a brilliant Muslim leader named Saladin decisively defeated the Christian forces at a brutal battle and went on to recapture Jerusalem itself, ending nearly 90 years of Christian control over the city. You feel the shockwave of it ripple across Europe. The holy city lost, the unthinkable made real. When the news reached the West, it landed like a thunderclap, and the chroniclers tell us that the elderly Pope was so devastated by the tidings that he died shortly afterwards, struck down, they said, by sheer grief. Out of that grief rose a fevered new call to arms, a summons for a great expedition to win Jerusalem back. The campaign history would remember as the Third Crusade, and the greatest kings of Europe answered it. You watch three of the most powerful rulers in the Western world take up the cause, pledging to march east and reclaim the city. There was the aged and legendary Holy Roman Emperor, a grizzled warrior of fearsome reputation. There was the cunning young King of France, Richard's sometime ally and eternal rival. And there was Richard himself, who threw himself into the cause with the kind of total consuming passion that only he could muster. You should understand that for Richard this was not a calculated political move dressed up in piety. By all accounts, he genuinely burned for it. Here was a war worthy of his restless energy, a war blessed by God, a war that promised eternal glory and the salvation of his soul all at once. Remember the man we have watched all along, the one who only ever felt fully alive when something was happening, when there was a campaign to plan and an enemy to face. Now imagine handing that man the single greatest, most glorious military undertaking of his entire age. You can see his eyes light up across the centuries. This is the war he was quite literally born for. To take up the cause was to take the cross, a solemn vow marked by sewing a cross onto one's garments and pledging before God to march for the Holy City. And here is your quirky tidbit, because the timing of Richard's vow reveals just how deep the obsession ran. Richard had actually pledged himself to the crusade even before his father died, before he was king at all, becoming one of the very first major nobles north of the Alps to take the cross in response to the fall of Jerusalem. The crown of England, when it finally came to him, was almost an inconvenience, a thing he needed mainly because it gave him the resources to fund the holy war he had already vowed to fight. You realize with a small jolt that he wanted Jerusalem before he ever truly wanted England. Now lean into the strangeness of these crusading vows, because they bound men in ways both spiritual and dangerously practical. To take the cross was to commit not only your sword, but very often your entire fortune, your lands, your future, all staked on a journey from which a great many men simply never returned. It was, in modern terms, the ultimate all-or-nothing gamble, and Richard, never a man for half measures, was prepared to wager absolutely everything on it. The piggy bank of England, the offices, the titles, the lands, all of it we now understand was being gathered toward this one shimmering goal. Historians still argue whether Richard's crusading zeal sprang from sincere religious devotion or from a warrior's hunger for the ultimate glory, the chance to be remembered as the greatest soldier of his age. Was he a man on his knees before God, or a man chasing immortality through conquest? You suspect, and many scholars would agree, that in Richard the two motives were so tangled together as to be inseparable. He could be genuinely pious and ferociously ambitious in the very same breath, and the crusade offered to satisfy both halves of his nature at once. Faith and glory marching east under the same banner. You watch the great preparations begin to stir across his vast domains, the gathering of men, of ships, of supplies on a scale that staggers the imagination. To move an army across the entire length of the Mediterranean world, to feed it, arm it, and keep it from falling apart on the long road, was an undertaking of breathtaking complexity. And all of it had to be paid for, which brings us right back to that ruthless emptying of England's coffers we glimpsed last time. The vow has been made. The cross is sown. The holy city waits in the distant heat, lost and longed for. But wanting Jerusalem and reaching Jerusalem are two enormously different things, separated by oceans, mountains, rival kings, dwindling money, and the small matter of the most brilliant enemy Richard would ever face. You can feel the immensity of what lies ahead, the sheer audacity of one restless king deciding to hurl himself and his entire kingdom's wealth at a city half a world away. The dream is set ablaze in his heart. Now comes the staggering, almost impossible work of turning that dream into an army. And to build that army, Richard is about to put nearly everything he owns up for sale. You arrive now at the great fire sale, the moment when Richard turns his entire inheritance into a giant rummage sale in service of his holy obsession. Remember that cheeky line about selling London itself if only he could find a buyer? Tonight you watch him come alarmingly close to meaning it literally. The vow has been made, the cross is sewn onto his garments, and now comes the staggeringly expensive business of actually paying for a war on the far side of the world. You need to grasp just how enormous the cost of a crusade truly was, because it boggles the medieval mind every bit as much as it might boggle yours. Moving an army of thousands across the entire length of the Mediterranean was not a matter of packing a few wagons and setting off. It meant building or hiring fleets of ships. It meant arms and armor horses by the 1,000 food-water tents, wages for soldiers and sailors, gifts to keep allies sweet, and a vast cushion of treasure to handle the endless emergencies of a campaign lasting years. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight. The Third Crusade required one of the largest sums of money any English king had ever attempted to raise, and Richard pursued it with a single-minded ruthlessness that left contemporaries genuinely astonished. You watch him set about it with the cold efficiency of a man who has decided that nothing, absolutely nothing, matters more than the goal in front of him. And so the selling begins. Royal castles, lordships, sheriffdoms, the right to hold high office, charters of privilege for towns, exemptions and titles and honours of every kind, all of it goes up for sale to whoever can produce the coin. Men who wanted power, status or local control suddenly found that the new king was happy to hand it over, provided they paid handsomely for the privilege. The kingdom, as we said before, became a machine for generating treasure, and Richard turned its handle without a flicker of sentiment. Here is a quirky and rather telling tidbit. Richard sold off positions and rights that were arguably his to use, rather than truly his to give away, cheerfully cashing in on the future to fund the present. He reshuffled the great offices of the realm, dismissing officials his father had appointed, and reappointing many of them, or new men entirely, in exchange for fresh payments, essentially charging people to keep or obtain the very jobs they already held. You find a dark comedy in it. Imagine being told you can keep your own position, but only if you buy it back. Richard had in effect invented a particularly brazen form of medieval crowdfunding with the whole of England as his reluctant donor base. You begin to see how this connects to that absent king we met last time, the one who treated England as a purse rather than a home. The fire sale was the purse being emptied in earnest, and it had consequences that rippled far beyond the crusade. By selling offices to the highest bidder rather than the most capable hand, Richard scattered power across his kingdom in ways that would prove dangerous the moment his back was turned. Remember that quiet, watchful brother John, the one I keep telling you to keep an eye on? He was among those granted enormous lands and influence in this great redistribution, accumulating a power base that would later tempt him toward outright treachery. Richard, in his haste to fund one war, was unknowingly sowing the seeds of another much closer to home. Now lean into the human texture of all this, because the fire sale was not only about castles and coin, it was about people staking everything on a journey many would not survive. To take the cross and march east, lords and knights across Richard's domains mortgaged their lands, emptied their coffers and bet their entire futures on a war from which a great many would never return. Whole families poured generations of accumulated wealth into the gamble. You feel the weight of all those private fortunes flowing into one vast river of treasure, all of it bending toward Jerusalem, all of it built on hope, faith, and a king's unshakable conviction. And yet, for all his ruthlessness, you should not imagine Richard as merely greedy. The money was not for himself. It vanished almost as fast as it appeared into the bottomless expense of the Holy War. He was not hoarding gold in a vault. He was converting an entire kingdom's wealth into ships and swords and the means to move an army half a world away, spending it nearly as quickly as he could raise it. The fire sale was not avarice. It was obsession total, and consuming the same all-or-nothing nature we have watched in him since he was a teenage warlord crushing barons in the southern sun. Historians still argue whether Richard's reckless liquidation of royal resources was the brilliant, decisive act of a man who understood exactly what his great enterprise demanded, or a short-sighted squandering of his father's carefully built inheritance that weakened the English crown for years to come. Was he a king with the courage to stake everything on a worthy cause, or a gambler so consumed by glory that he mortgaged his realm's stability for a dream? You sense as ever with Richard that both judgments hold a piece of the truth, and that the same trait could look like genius or folly, depending entirely on where you stood. You watch the treasure pile grow, ship by ship, chest by chest, until at last Richard has assembled the means to launch his great expedition. The kingdom has been shaken upside down, its coffers drained, its offices reshuffled, its future quietly mortgaged, all to put one restless king at the head of one enormous army pointed east. The preparations are nearly complete. The fleets are gathering. The men are mustering. And Richard, who has wanted this more than he ever wanted the crown itself, stands on the threshold of the journey that will define him. But the road to Jerusalem is long, and it does not begin with glory. It begins with storms and seasickness and squabbling allies, and the thousand small miseries of moving a vast army across an unforgiving world. The treasure is gathered. The vow burns bright. Now the great grinding journey east is about to begin, and you, dear listener, are coming along for every weary mile of it. You set out now on the great journey itself, and I want you to lower your expectations of glamour right away, because the road to the Holy Land does not begin with trumpets and banners snapping in heroic sunlight. It begins, as so many grand adventures do, with logistics, seasickness, and a truly remarkable amount of arguing. Remember all that treasure Richard wrung from England? The fire sale of castles and offices. Now you get to watch it transform into ships, men, and the thousand small headaches of moving an army across the entire length of the known world. You join the expedition as it gathers in the year 1190, an enormous undertaking by any measure. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight. Rather than marching the whole way overland, Richard chose largely to move his forces by sea, assembling a substantial fleet to carry men, horses, weapons, and supplies down through the Mediterranean toward the Holy Land. This was a sophisticated and ambitious choice, sparing his army the brutal overland slog through hostile territory that had destroyed earlier crusades, though it brought its own particular brand of misery, namely the open sea. And the open sea, you quickly discover, is no respecter of kings. You feel the great fleet pitch and roll as storms scatter the ships across the water, separating vessels, sinking, some outright washing precious supplies and unlucky men into the depths. The chroniclers describe terrifying tempests that flung the fleet apart and left Richard frantically gathering his scattered forces in foreign harbours. You huddle on a heaving deck, green-faced, and reflect that the lion-hearted glory of crusading looks rather less majestic when you are clutching the rail and praying not to be tipped into the waves. Even the bravest warrior, it turns out, can be humbled by a bad crossing. You travel alongside the King of France, that cunning rival we keep meeting because the two monarchs set out together, at least in theory, as partners in the great holy enterprise. And here is where the squabbling truly begins, because Richard and Philip of France were quite possibly the two men in Christendom least suited to cooperating on anything. Their alliance was a fragile thing, riddled with old resentments, wounded pride, and competing ambitions, and it began to fray almost the moment they left home. You watch them bicker over precedence, over money, over honour, over a tangled web of personal grievances, like two brilliant, prickly men forced to share a very long and uncomfortable car journey. Now lean in for your quirky tidbit, because the journey east was interrupted by a long, strange winter layover in a place soaked in sunshine and tension. The two kings and their armies wintered on the island of Sicily, and rather than resting peacefully, they managed to get thoroughly entangled in local politics and disputes. Richard, never one to sit quietly when there was a quarrel to be had, ended up actually storming and capturing the city of Messina after a dispute with its inhabitants, planting his banners over a Christian city he was supposedly merely passing through on his way to fight for Christendom. You find a dark comedy in it. The great crusader on his way to liberate the Holy Land, pausing to sack a city full of fellow Christians because things got heated. The road to holiness, it seems, had some decidedly unholy detours. The Sicilian winter also tangled Richard in family business because his sister had been queen there, and there were disputes over her dowry and her freedom that Richard, ever the protective and combative brother, was determined to settle by force, if necessary. You begin to see a pattern in him that will hold for the entire crusade. Wherever Richard goes, he leaves a trail of resolved grievances. Cowed opponents and slightly bewildered locals wondering how a king merely passing through managed to upend their entire situation. He simply cannot help himself. Conflict follows him like a loyal hound. It was during this long layover that another thread of the story tightened, one that would matter enormously to Richard's future. His formidable mother, Eleanor, freed at last from her 16 years of captivity, and now a vigorous force in her son's affairs, undertook an extraordinary journey of her own, travelling great distances, despite her advanced age, to bring Richard a bride, a princess named Berengaria. Remember Eleanor, the woman of the troubadour courts, the crusader queen, the prisoner finally restored to power. Here she is again, well into her later years, crossing mountains and seas to secure her son's marriage and his dynasty. You cannot help but admire her stamina. She is without question one of the most remarkable figures in this entire tale. Historians still argue whether these long delays in Sicily and elsewhere were a damaging waste of precious time and momentum that doomed the crusade to fall short, or a necessary and even shrewd period of consolidation, resupply, and securing of alliances before the truly dangerous work began. Was Richard dithering when he should have been racing east, or wisely strengthening his position for the brutal campaign ahead? You sense the scholars genuinely divided, and you can see the argument from both sides as the army lingers under the Sicilian sun, gathering its strength and getting on one another's nerves, in roughly equal measure. You feel the season finally turn, the storms ease, and the great fleet prepare once more to set sail toward the east, toward the Holy Land that still lies tantalizingly beyond the horizon. The crossings have been miserable, the quarrels exhausting, the detours bloody and bizarre, but the expedition has held together more or less, and Richard's iron will has kept it pointed in the right direction. You stand at the rail again, the wind freshening the long journey, grinding ever onward. But the sea has one more surprise in store before Richard reaches the Holy Land proper. One more island, one more unexpected conquest, one more place where this restless king will pause to seize what is in front of him, simply because it is. There to be seized, the fleet sails east, the storms gather and scatter it once more. And in the chaos of yet another tempest, Richard is about to be blown toward the shores of an island called Cyprus, where he will acquire in remarkably short order a wife, a fortune, and an entire kingdom he never originally set out to conquer. You sail on now into one of the most peculiar episodes of the entire crusade. The moment a king bound for Jerusalem accidentally conquers an island he had no plans to conquer, marries a princess and walks away considerably richer, all within the space of a few weeks. Remember how I told you that conflict follows Richard like a loyal hound on the island of Cyprus? That hound positively bounds ahead of him. Settle in, because this is the chapter where the Lionheart's habit of seizing whatever lies in front of him reaches its full, glorious absurdity. It begins, as so much of this journey does, with a storm. The great fleet sailing east from Sicily is once again scattered by tempest, and several ships are driven toward the shores of Cyprus, a wealthy and strategically vital island sitting in the eastern Mediterranean like a stepping stone toward the Holy Land. Among the vessels caught in this chaos are ships carrying two people of enormous importance to Richard, his sister, the same one whose affairs he had been settling in Sicily, and his bride-to-be, the Princess Berengaria, whom his tireless mother Eleanor had brought all that way to marry to him. Here is where things turn sour. The island of Cyprus was ruled at this time by a local tyrant, a self-proclaimed emperor of the island, a man whose judgment you are about to discover was catastrophically poor. When the storm-tossed ships carrying Richard's sister and his betrothed sought shelter and supplies, this ruler treated them with hostility rather than hospitality, reportedly threatening them and refusing them safe harbour. You can almost hear the collective intake of breath from anyone who knew Richard. Mistreating a crusading king's sister and bride was, to put it mildly, not a wise career move. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight. When Richard arrived and learned how his sister and his future queen had been treated, he responded with characteristic and overwhelming force, launching a swift conquest of the entire island and toppling its ruler in a remarkably short campaign. This was Richard at his most ferociously effective, descending on Cyprus like a thunderstorm and subduing it with the kind of speed and aggression that left everyone reeling. The local tyrant who had threatened his loved ones soon found his entire kingdom torn from his grasp. Now lean in for a quirky tidbit that captures Richard's flair for the theatrical. When the defeated ruler of Cyprus finally surrendered, he reportedly begged that he not be placed in iron chains, perhaps the one dignity he hoped to preserve. Richard, in a gesture that was either gracious mercy or pointed mockery, depending on how you read it, agreed, and had the man bound in chains of silver instead. You cannot help but smile at the sheer style of it. The deposed emperor got his wish technically. No iron, just precious metal restraints custom-fitted for a fallen tyrant. It is exactly the kind of grandly sarcastic gesture that makes Richard such a vivid figure across the centuries. Amid all this conquest, Richard paused to take care of personal business, and so it was on Cyprus, in the spring of the year 1191, that he finally married. Berengaria, the princess, his mother, had travelled so far to deliver. You watch the ceremony unfold on the conquered island, a king crowning his new queen in a place he had owned for only a matter of days. There is something fitting and slightly mad about it, a wedding celebrated atop a freshly seized kingdom, glory and romance, and conquest all braided together in Richard's restless style. But here is a poignant and quirky note about that marriage, the kind of detail that lingers. Despite the dramatic circumstances of their wedding, Richard and Berengaria's marriage would prove strangely distant and produce no children, and the Queen would spend remarkably little time in her husband's company over the years that followed. She holds the curious distinction of being one of the few English queens who may have never even set foot in England at all. You feel a quiet sadness in it. The bride brought across mountains and seas, married atop a conquered island, would remain forever on the edges of her warrior husband's restless, war-filled life. You should also understand why Cyprus mattered so much beyond the personal grievance that sparked its conquest. The island was enormously valuable, rich in resources, and perfectly positioned as a supply base and stepping stone for crusading armies operating in the Holy Land. By seizing it, Richard had almost by accident gained an asset of tremendous strategic worth, a secure springboard from which Christian forces could be supplied and reinforced. He had set out merely to avenge an insult to his family, and ended up acquiring one of the most useful possessions of the entire crusade. Even his accidents, it seems, turned to advantage. Historians still argue whether the conquest of Cyprus was a brilliant strategic masterstroke that secured a vital base for the crusade, or simply another of Richard's impulsive opportunistic seizures that happened to work out well after the fact. Was he a far-sighted commander who recognized the island's worth, or a hot-tempered king who conquered a kingdom in a fit of family loyalty and only later realized what a prize he had stumbled into? Instincts so tightly entwined that even he might not have been able to separate calculation from temper. You watch Richard settle the island's affairs with his usual brisk efficiency, extracting wealth, installing arrangements to keep it secure, and adding its considerable treasure to his already substantial war chest. The accidental conqueror had turned a storm and an insult into a wife, a fortune and a kingdom, all in a matter of weeks. Remember that bottomless expense of the crusade we discussed. Cyprus helped fill the coffers right back up, a windfall delivered by sheer lion-hearted momentum. And now, at last, with his marriage, made his island won and his treasury replenished, Richard turns his prow once more toward the true goal that has burned in him since before he was even king. The detours are done. The Holy Land lies just ahead now, and the great crusading army is converging on a brutal, grinding siege already underway by the sea, a deadlock of years that Richard, with all his ferocity and all his fortune, has come at last to break. You arrive at last on the shores of the Holy Land itself, and the very air changes around you. Remember all those storms, those squabbles in Sicily, that accidental kingdom won on Cyprus. They were merely the long, weary overture. Now the real war begins, and it begins in the most brutal possible way. At a city by the sea where thousands of men have already been killing and dying for years in a deadlock that simply refuses to break. The place is called Acre, and Richard arrives in the summer of the year 1191 to throw his full ferocious weight against it. You should understand what a siege truly was in this world, because it was nothing like the swift, dramatic battles of legend. A siege was a grinding war of patience, hunger, and disease, a contest to see which side could endure misery longest before breaking. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight. By the time Richard reached Acre, the city had already been under siege by crusading forces for nearly 2 years, an agonizing stalemate in which the Christian army besieging the city was itself surrounded and harassed by Saladin's relieving forces, creating a strange and deadly situation where the besiegers were themselves besieged. You take a moment to picture the grim geography of it. There sits the coastal city of Acre, held by Saladin's garrison, its walls stout and its defenders determined. Around it presses the Crusader army, trying to starve and batter the city into surrender. And around the Crusaders in turn looms Saladin's own field army, watching, raiding, waiting for a chance to crush the besiegers from behind. It is a deadly sandwich, a war within a war, and for 2 long years it had ground on with no resolution, the men on all sides wasting away in heat, filth, and disease. And the disease, you should know, was a horror all its own. The Crusader camp before Acre had become a festering breeding ground for sickness and illness, killed far more men than enemy arrows ever did. Here is a grim tidbit that captures just how lethal these camps were. Among the countless men of high rank who perished not in battle but from disease during the long siege, the sheer scale of death by sickness rather than combat astonished even hardened observers. For every man who fell heroically with a sword in his hand, many more simply wasted away in fevered misery in a stinking tent, the unglamorous and overwhelming reality of medieval warfare. But then Richard arrived, and the whole exhausted, stalemated situation changed almost overnight. Because if there was one thing the Lionheart understood in his very bones, it was how to break a siege. You watch him fling himself into the work with that consuming energy we have come to know so well. He brought fresh troops, fresh treasure, fresh siege engines, and above all, a fresh, relentless will to win that electrified the worn-down besieging army. Where others had settled into grim endurance, Richard brought aggression, urgency, and an absolute refusal to accept the deadlock. Here is your mainstream anchor for what followed. Within a matter of weeks of Richard's arrival, the long, years-defying siege of Acre finally broke, and the city surrendered to the Crusaders. The deadlock that had consumed thousands of lives over 2 agonizing years collapsed shortly after the Lionheart threw his full force against it. You can see why his reputation soared. He had done in weeks what the assembled might of Christendom had failed to do in years. The legend of Richard as the supreme soldier of his age was being forged right here in the dust and smoke before the walls of Acre. You should know, though, that the fall of Acre also produced one of the darkest and most controversial episodes of Richard's entire career, a stain that historians have wrestled with ever since. In the aftermath of the city's surrender, amid disputes over the terms of the agreement, the ransoming of prisoners and the exchange of captives with Saladin, negotiations broke down in bitter recrimination. And in the grim sequel to that breakdown, a great number of the captured garrison were put to death on Richard's orders, a mass killing of prisoners that shocked even a brutal age. You feel the chill of it. The same ferocity that broke the siege showed here its cruelest, most ruthless face. Historians still argue fiercely over this terrible act, over whether it was a cold and calculated military decision forced by the collapse of negotiations and the practical impossibility of guarding so many captives, or a savage atrocity, born of impatience and rage that forever shadowed Richard's name. Was it the grim logic of a commander who could not afford to be encumbered or betrayed, or a moment of brutal cruelty that no strategic excuse can fully redeem? You sense the genuine difficulty of it, the way this single dark act sits uncomfortably alongside the gallantry and brilliance that fill so much of his legend. The Lionheart, you are reminded, was a real man in a savage world, capable of both dazzling courage and chilling ruthlessness, sometimes within the very same campaign. You stand amid the fallen city, the long siege finally ended, the Crusader banners raised at last over walls that had defied them for 2 terrible years. The victory was real, and it was enormous, reopening the path for the Crusade to press onward toward its ultimate goal. Richard's arrival had transformed a hopeless stalemate into a triumph, and the whole Christian army now looked to him as its driving force, its true commander, the man whose will could bend even the most stubborn fortress to surrender. But Acre was only the gateway, the first hard-won step on a road that still stretched toward distant Jerusalem. And waiting along that road, watching, calculating, ever patient and ever formidable, was the one opponent worthy of Richard in every way, the brilliant Sultan whose name we have mentioned again and again, the man whose rivalry with the Lionheart would become one of the most celebrated relationships in all of history. You have heard his name echoing through our story. Now it is time to meet him properly, for the next stretch of this great war belongs as much to Saladin as it does to Richard. You pause now in the smoke and triumph of fallen Acre to meet properly, and at last the one man in this entire story who stands as Richard's true equal. We have mentioned his name again and again, watched his shadow fall across the crusade, felt his armies pressing at the edges of every siege. Now it is time to truly know him, because the rivalry between Richard the Lionheart and the Sultan Saladin became across the centuries one of the most celebrated relationships in all of history. A contest of arms wrapped around a strange and genuine mutual respect that crossed the great divide of faith and war. You should first set aside whatever cartoonish image of a crusade villain might be lurking in your mind, because Saladin deserves far better than that. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight. Saladin was a Kurdish-born leader who rose to unite much of the Muslim Near East under his command, and who became renowned among friends and enemies alike for his chivalry, his generosity, and his sense of honor. He was not merely a brilliant general, though he was certainly that. He was a ruler whose reputation for nobility was so powerful that even his Christian opponents, the very men he fought, wrote of him with admiration. In an age of savagery, Saladin became a legend for his restraint. You think back to the moment that set this entire crusade in motion, when Saladin recaptured Jerusalem in the year 1187. And here is a detail that tells you everything about the man. When his forces took the holy city, Saladin did not unleash the slaughter that earlier conquerors had inflicted. The Christian capture of Jerusalem generations before had been infamous for its bloodshed, but when Saladin retook it, he allowed the Christian inhabitants to ransom themselves and depart in relative safety, and for many who could not pay he, and his commanders showed a mercy that astonished the chroniclers. You feel the weight of that contrast. The man cast as the great enemy of Christendom behaved in his hour of total victory with a humanity that put many of his opponents to shame. Now lean in for the quirky and rather wonderful tidbit that defines the relationship between these two titans. Throughout their long contest, Richard and Saladin engaged in an extraordinary exchange of courtesies, even as their armies tried to destroy each other. They sent each other gifts, traded messages through emissaries, and on at least one famous occasion, when Richard fell gravely ill with fever, Saladin reportedly sent him fresh fruit and snow from the mountains to cool his sickness. You sit with that image for a moment. Two enemy commanders locked in a brutal holy war, and one sends the other snow to ease his fever. It is the kind of detail that sounds invented too perfect to be real. And yet the stories of their mutual chivalry were celebrated by both sides almost from the moment they occurred. There is another famous tale, beloved by the chroniclers, that captures the strange respect between them. It is said that during a parley, the two leaders, or their representatives, displayed their martial prowess to one another. Richard demonstrating the brute power of a European broadsword by cleaving through a heavy iron bar, and Saladin answering with the exquisite craftsmanship of an Eastern blade so sharp it could slice through a floating silk scarf or a cushion drifting in the air. Whether or not this particular contest ever truly happened, and historians lean heavily toward legend, it perfectly captures how the two men were remembered not as monster and hero, but as two different kinds of greatness. Two civilizations meeting through their finest champions. You should understand, though, that all this mutual respect never softened the war itself. These were two men who would have happily seen the other defeated, two commanders who fought each other with everything they had. The chivalry and the gifts coexisted with relentless, deadly conflict, which is precisely what makes the relationship so fascinating. It was not friendship in any simple sense. It was something stranger and more profound, the recognition by each man of a worthy opponent, a respect earned on the battlefield and expressed through gestures of honor even as the killing continued. Saladin, you discover, was as patient as Richard was, impetuous, as measured as Richard was fiery. Where Richard burned with restless aggression, Saladin played a longer, subtler game content to harass, to wait, to wear down his opponent through endurance and the simple advantages of fighting on his own ground, far from the Crusaders' Arthur, distant homes. You begin to see why these two were so evenly matched. Richard could win nearly any battle he chose to fight, but Saladin understood that he did not need to win battles. He only needed to make sure Richard could never hold what he won. It was a contest between a hammer and the patient earth that absorbs its blows. Historians still argue whether the celebrated chivalry between Richard and Saladin reflects a genuine, remarkable mutual regard between two extraordinary men, or whether the tales were heavily embellished by later writers on both sides who found in this noble rivalry a story too good and too useful to leave plain. Did these two titans truly admire one another? Or did chroniclers and poets sculpt their relationship into the legend the world wanted it to be? You sense that, as with so much in this tale, the kernel of truth and the bloom of legend have grown so intertwined that they can no longer be fully separated, and perhaps that is exactly as it should. End 40. You stand between the two great camps, now the Crusader host and Saladin's army, two formidable forces led by two men who have come in their strange way to understand one another better than they understand almost anyone else. the war is far from over. Jerusalem still waits beyond the hills and the hardest fighting lies ahead. But you carry with you now a fuller sense of the contest. Not a simple clash of good against evil, but a meeting of two remarkable leaders, each the measure of the other. And the next phase of that contest is about to test both men to their limits, as Richard leads his army out from the safety of the coast on a long, grueling march down the shoreline, harried every weary step of the way toward a hard-fought clash that will prove once and for all just how formidable the Lionheart truly is in open battle. You leave the captured walls of Acre behind now and step into the open, into the long, grueling march that will test Richard's discipline as severely as any siege ever tested his ferocity. Remember how I described Saladin as the patient earth that absorbs the hammer's blows? The man who did not need to win battles, only to make sure Richard could never hold what he won. Here, on the dusty coastal road south, that patient strategy meets the Lionheart's iron will in one of the most famous marches in military history. Richard's goal is to move his army down the Mediterranean shoreline toward the port of Jaffa, a vital stepping stone on the road to Jerusalem itself. And here you see Richard the commander at his most brilliant, not the reckless berserker of legend, but a careful, disciplined general who understood exactly how dangerous this march would be. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight. Richard organized his army for the coastal march with remarkable discipline, keeping his fleet sailing alongside on his right flank to supply the troops and protect that side, while arranging his soldiers in tight, well-ordered formations to guard against the constant harassment he knew was coming. And come it did. You trudge along the hot coastal road and feel the relentless pressure of Saladin's forces, who shadowed the Crusader column every weary step of the way, raining down arrows, launching sudden raids, and trying desperately to provoke the Christian soldiers into breaking their formation. This was Saladin's whole strategy in miniature: to harass, to bait, to wear the Crusaders down and tempt them into a disorganized charge that could be surrounded and destroyed. The discipline required to absorb that punishment without breaking ranks was almost superhuman, and you marvel that Richard held his army together through it at all. Here is a vivid and quirky tidbit that captures the sheer misery of that march. The Crusaders suffered terribly from the relentless arrows, but their thick, padded armor often saved their lives in the strangest way, with chroniclers describing soldiers trudging onward, stuck so full of arrows that they looked like walking pincushions or hedgehogs, the shafts bristling from their padded coats, while the men themselves marched on wounded but alive. You find a grim, almost comic image in it: an entire army shuffling down the coast, looking like enormous irritated porcupines, too disciplined to break and too well padded to fall. The heat, the thirst, the constant whistle of arrows, all of it endured under Richard's unbending command. You should understand the extraordinary self-control this demanded, because every instinct in those harassed soldiers screamed at them to turn and charge their tormentors. Richard knew that the moment his men broke ranks to chase the raiders, Saladin would pounce and the whole army could be shattered piece by piece. So he held them back, forced them to absorb blow after blow without retaliating, waiting with a patience that must have cost his fiery soul dearly for exactly the right moment to strike. It was a masterclass in discipline from a man more famous for his recklessness, and it reveals a depth to his generalship that the legends often overlook. Then came the climax near a place called Arsuf, where the long-simmering tension finally erupted into open battle. Saladin, sensing his chance, threw the full weight of his forces against the marching column, hoping to overwhelm it. And here at last Richard let his army strike. The disciplined formations that had absorbed so much punishment now turned and unleashed a devastating counterattack, the Crusader knights crashing into Saladin's forces with shattering force. Here is your mainstream anchor for the outcome. At the Battle of Arsuf, Richard won a clear and important victory in open field, breaking Saladin's assault and proving that the Sultan's army could indeed be beaten in a pitched fight. The victory at Arsuf mattered enormously, and not only for the ground it gained, it punctured an aura of invincibility that had grown around Saladin since his triumph at Jerusalem. For the first time in a long while, the great Sultan had been bested in open battle, and the Crusader army, so recently mired in the hopeless deadlock at Acre, surged with renewed confidence. Richard had shown that the Lionheart was not merely a besieger of cities, but a master of the open field, capable of beating the finest general of the age at his own game. You feel the morale of the whole crusade lift as the news spreads. And yet here is the sobering truth that the legend tends to gloss over. For all its glory, Arsuf was not a knockout blow. Saladin's army, though defeated, was not destroyed. It withdrew, regrouped, and remained very much intact, ready to resume its patient strategy of harassment and attrition. Remember the patient earth absorbing the hammer. One mighty blow, however well struck, did not break it. Saladin had lost a battle, but he had not lost the war, and he understood, perhaps better than Richard did, that the deeper contest would be decided not by a single dramatic clash, but by the slow grind of supply, distance, and endurance. Historians still argue whether Arsuf was a genuinely decisive strategic triumph that secured the coastal road and reshaped the campaign, or merely a brilliant tactical victory that looked magnificent, yet failed to fundamentally change Saladin's underlying advantages. Did Richard win something that truly mattered in the long run, or simply win a glorious battle that flattered his legend, while the deeper realities of the war remained stubbornly unchanged? You sense the scholars genuinely torn the answer, hanging somewhere in the gap between the thrill of the victory and the hard arithmetic of what came after. You stand on the field at Arsuf as the dust settles, the Crusader banners flying high, Saladin's forces drawing back, Richard's reputation soaring to new heights. The march has been survived, the battle has been won, the road to Jaffa and beyond it, the road toward Jerusalem, lies open at last. It feels in this shining moment as though nothing can stop the Lionheart from reaching the holy city that has burned in his heart since before he was even king. But the cruelest part of this entire war is not the fighting. It is the mathematics, the brutal logic of supply lines, weather and distance that no amount of courage can overcome. And as Richard turns at last toward Jerusalem itself, climbing inland toward the prize, he is about to collide with a reality that all his ferocity, all his discipline, all his hard-won victories simply cannot conquer. You turn now toward the prize itself, the shimmering goal that has burned at the center of this entire story since Richard first sewed the cross onto his garments before he was even king. Jerusalem, the holy city, the whole reason for the storms, the fire sale of England, the accidental conquest of Cyprus, the brutal siege of Acre, the Porcupine March, and the glory of Arsuf. All of it has been pointing here toward the moment when Richard climbs inland from the coast to seize the city he has crossed the world to win. And here, dear listener, is where the cruelest lesson of the entire crusade waits for him, because Richard is about to collide with an enemy that no courage can defeat. That enemy is arithmetic. Remember how I warned you that the cruelest part of this war was not the fighting but the mathematics, the brutal logic of supply lines, weather and distance. Now you feel its full weight. Jerusalem does not sit on the coast conveniently beside the sea where Richard's fleet can supply his army. It lies inland up in the rocky hill country, separated from the friendly shoreline by miles of harsh, broken terrain. And every mile inland Richard marches, stretches his supply lines thinner, drags his army further from the ships that feed it, and deeper into territory where Saladin's patient strategy can do its deadliest work. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight. Despite reaching the hill country and coming by some accounts within mere miles of Jerusalem itself, Richard twice advanced toward the holy city, and twice concluded that he could not safely besiege and hold it, withdrawing on both occasions, without an assault. You feel the agony of that decision, so close. Close enough, perhaps, to glimpse the distant outline of the city in the haze, and yet forced to turn back not by defeat in battle, but by the cold, undeniable logic of what would happen next. You should understand the trap that Jerusalem represented because it is a thing of grim and beautiful clarity. Even if Richard managed to capture the city, he would then have to hold it, and holding it would mean defending an inland fortress at the end of a long, vulnerable supply line, surrounded by Saladin's still intact army, which we know survived Arsuf perfectly well. Saladin had wisely stripped the surrounding countryside, poisoning wells and destroying supplies, so that any besieging Crusader army would itself starve in the barren hills. Richard, the master of sieges, understood better than anyone that he would become the besieged the moment he won. Taking the city was possible. Keeping it was a fantasy. And there was a deeper problem still, one that cut to the very heart of the crusade. Most of the crusaders had come to win Jerusalem to fulfill their vows to pray at the holy places. The moment the city fell, the vast majority of them would consider their task complete and simply go home, sailing back to Europe and leaving Richard with a captured city and almost no army to defend it. Saladin would then sweep back in and retake it within months, and the whole bloody enterprise would have achieved nothing lasting. Richard could see this grim sequence with perfect clarity, and it must have been torment, because it meant that the very prize he had crossed the world to seize was in cold strategic terms a poisoned one. Here is a quirky and deeply human tidbit that the chroniclers cherished. There is a famous story that during one of these advances Richard came to a vantage point from which the holy city of Jerusalem could be seen in the distance, and that he raised his shield before his own eyes, refusing to look upon the city. He knew he could not win, declaring that a man who was not worthy to capture Jerusalem should not be permitted even to gaze upon it. Whether or not the moment happened exactly so, you feel its emotional truth like a blade. The greatest warrior of his age, brought to the very edge of his life's ambition, covering his eyes rather than look upon the prize his strategic mind told him he could never truly hold. The weather too conspired against him. The campaigns through the hill country were plagued by harsh conditions, by rain and cold, and the misery of supply lines failing in difficult terrain. Disease and desertion thinned the crusader ranks. The army that had marched so triumphantly down the coast began to fray as the brutal realities of inland campaigning set in. Even Richard's own iron will and the soaring confidence of Arsuf could not overcome the simple grinding facts of mud, hunger, and distance. Historians still argue fiercely over whether Richard's decision to turn back from Jerusalem was the mark of a clear-eyed, brilliant commander who refused to throw his army away on a prize he could never keep, or a tragic failure of nerve and ambition that squandered the Crusade's best, and perhaps only chance to retake the holy city. Was it wisdom, or was it defeat, dressed up as prudence? You sense the genuine difficulty of it, the way reasonable judges have come down on both sides for centuries. Some see a general too sensible to chase a doomed glory. Others see a man who came all that way only to flinch at the final step. The truth, as ever with Richard, refuses to settle. You stand in those bleak hills now, the holy city, tantalizingly near, and yet impossibly far, the whole crusade, hanging suspended on the edge of a goal it can almost touch but can never grasp. Everything Richard has done, every coin spent, every life lost, every storm weathered and siege broken, has brought him to this aching threshold, and the threshold will not be crossed. The arithmetic is merciless. The city will not fall, or if it falls, it will not stay fallen, and Richard the Lionheart, the supreme soldier of his age, must swallow the bitterest truth a conqueror can face, that the thing he wanted most lies forever just beyond his reach. And so the great dream begins slowly and painfully to give way to something far less glorious but far more practical, the hard, unglamorous work of negotiation. If Jerusalem cannot be taken, then perhaps something can still be salvaged, some arrangement reached, some thread of the dream preserved. Richard the warrior must now become Richard the diplomat, and the long, exhausting war must find its way at last toward an uneasy and bittersweet peace. You come now to the bittersweet close of the Great Crusade, the moment when the warrior must sheathe his sword not in triumph but in weary compromise. Remember Richard standing in those bleak hills, raising his shield to avoid even looking upon the Jerusalem he knew he could never hold. That was the death of the dream as conquest. What remains now is the harder, quieter task of salvaging something from all that blood and treasure, of turning a war that could not be won into a peace that could at least be lived with. You should understand that by this point both Richard and Saladin were exhausted, and not only in body. The war had ground on for years. Both armies were depleted, both treasuries strained, both leaders weary of a contest that neither could decisively win. Richard, for all his ferocity, could not take and hold Jerusalem. Saladin, for all his patience, could not drive the Crusaders from the coastal strongholds they had reclaimed. The two titans had fought each other to a kind of magnificent standstill, and each in his way knew it. The hammer could not shatter the earth, and the earth could not bury the hammer. There were urgent reasons, too, pulling Richard's attention back toward home, and they cast a long shadow over the negotiations. Remember that quiet, watchful brother John, the one I have told you again and again to keep your eye on. While Richard had been away winning glory in the Holy Land, John had been busy back in the Angevin lands, scheming with that cunning rival, the King of France, who had long since abandoned the Crusade and returned home to make mischief. Word reached Richard that his kingdom and his continental empire were in danger, that his brother and his rival were conspiring to strip him of everything while his back was turned. The Crusader king suddenly had powerful reasons to wrap up his eastern adventure and race home. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight. After his campaigns failed to retake Jerusalem, Richard negotiated a truce with Saladin in the year 1192, an agreement that allowed the Crusaders to keep a strip of territory along the coast and crucially guaranteed Christian pilgrims safe access to visit the holy places in Jerusalem, even though the city itself remained firmly under Saladin's control. You feel the careful balance of it. Richard had not won the city, but he had won the right for his fellow Christians to walk its sacred streets in peace, a genuine achievement wrung from a war that had fallen short of its grandest aim. And here is the poignant, quirky tidbit that captures the strange nobility of the whole affair. Richard himself, the king who had crossed the entire world and shed so much for the holy city, never once set foot in Jerusalem. By some accounts, Saladin graciously offered him the chance to visit as a pilgrim under the truce, and Richard refused, declaring that he would not enter as a mere guest a city he had failed to win by his sword. You sit with that proud, sorrowful choice for a moment. The man who wanted Jerusalem more than he ever wanted the crown of England turned away from its gates rather than enter it on any terms but conquest. There is something heartbreaking and entirely characteristic in it, the wounded pride of a warrior who would rather not see his prize at all than see it without having won it. You should appreciate, too, the genuine accomplishment that the truce represented, because it is easy to focus only on the failure to take the city and miss what was actually preserved. The Christian foothold in the Holy Land, which had been on the very brink of total collapse when Richard arrived, was now stabilized and secured for years to come. The coastal cities, the lifeline of the Crusader states, remained in Christian hands. Pilgrims could once again make their sacred journeys in safety. Richard had arrived to find the cause nearly lost, and departed having salvaged a sustainable, if diminished, Christian presence in the region. By the brutal standards of what was actually possible, this was no small thing. Historians still argue whether the Truce of 1192 should be remembered as a pragmatic triumph that rescued the Crusader states from annihilation and secured tangible benefits for Christian pilgrims, or as a fundamental failure that left the central goal, Jerusalem itself, unachieved, despite an almost unimaginable expenditure of lives and wealth. Was Richard a realist who salvaged the best outcome, a hopeless situation allowed, or a king who spent the riches of a kingdom and the lives of thousands only to fall short of the one thing that truly mattered? You sense the debate will never fully resolve, because both judgments contain a hard kernel of truth, and Richard's legacy as a crusader has always trembled between glory and disappointment. You watch the mood in the Crusader camp as the truce takes hold, and it is a complicated, melancholy thing. There is relief, certainly the simple animal relief of men who will not have to fight and die in the hills any longer. But there is also grief and a sense of incompleteness, the ache of having come so very far and accomplished so much, and yet not the one thing they had all dreamed of. The vows that had launched them, the burning desire to pray in a liberated Jerusalem, would go unfulfilled. They had won battles, broken sieges, and secured a peace, but the holy city remained beyond their reach, shimmering and lost. And for Richard himself, the truce marked the end of the great purpose that had consumed his entire reign. The war he was born for, the war he had wanted before he wanted anything else, was over, and it had ended not in the glorious capture of Jerusalem, but in a sober diplomatic arrangement, signed by two exhausted titans who had taken each other's measure and found neither could prevail. You feel the strange hollowness settling over him, the restless warrior with no more war to fight in the Holy Land, his eyes already turning anxiously homeward toward the kingdom and empire being undermined in his absence. But the journey home, dear listener, will prove to be the cruelest twist of all. For a king who had crossed the entire world and survived storms, sieges, and the finest general of his age, the most dangerous part of the whole adventure still lay ahead, not in the Holy Land at all, but on the long road back through the heart of Christian Europe, where old enemies waited, and where the Lionheart was about to become the most valuable prisoner in the entire world. You set out now on the journey home, and I want you to brace yourself because this is where the story takes its most absurd and humiliating turn. Picture it. A king who has crossed the entire world, survived monstrous storms, broken the unbreakable siege of Acre, bested the great Saladin in open battle, and stared down the holy city itself. And this man, this legend, is about to be undone not by a sword or an army, but by bad weather, bad luck, and a grudge so petty it would make a soap opera blush. Remember how I said the most dangerous part of the whole adventure lay not in the Holy Land but on the road home? Here it comes. The trouble begins, as it so often does in this tale, with the sea. Richard, racing homeward in late 1192 because of the schemes of his brother John and the King of France, was once again betrayed by the treacherous Mediterranean. Storms scattered and wrecked his intended route home, forcing him to abandon the safe sea passage and attempt instead a perilous overland journey across the heart of Europe. And this was a problem, an enormous problem, because Richard had spent the Crusade making enemies among his fellow Christian leaders, and the overland route ran straight through territory controlled by men who had very good reasons to want them in chains. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight. On his journey home, Richard was captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, a man he had personally and grievously insulted during the Crusade, and was then handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor, who held the English king prisoner and demanded an enormous ransom for his release. The most famous warrior king in Christendom, the hero of the Third Crusade, became a captive of his own supposed allies locked away in foreign fortresses, while Europe digested the astonishing news. You should understand the insult that lay behind this capture, because it is a wonderfully petty piece of history. Back at the siege of Acre, when the city fell, Duke Leopold had raised his own banner alongside those of the kings, claiming a share of the glory and the spoils, and Richard, never one to suffer a perceived inferior gladly, had reportedly ordered Leopold's banner torn down and thrown into the dirt, a public humiliation that the Duke never forgot and never forgave. You feel the delicious irony of it. The Lionheart brought low not by Saladin, not by the arithmetic of Jerusalem, but by a banner he had once tossed in the mud and a grudge he had been far too proud to bother smoothing over. Pride, it turns out, has a very long memory. Here is a quirky tidbit that captures just how famous and dramatic Richard's captivity became, the kind of detail that blooms into legend. There is a beloved story, almost certainly more romance than fact, that Richard's whereabouts were unknown for a time, and that a loyal minstrel named Blondel wandered across Europe searching for his imprisoned king, singing a song that he and Richard had supposedly composed together, until at last, beneath the walls of a certain castle, a voice answered back with the song's second verse, revealing the captive king within. Historians are quite sure this charming tale was invented or heavily embroidered by later writers, but it tells you everything about how Richard's imprisonment fired the medieval imagination. Even his captivity became poetry. You should also remember that earlier in our journey, I mentioned a surviving poem widely believed to have been written by Richard himself, composed in a dark moment. This is that moment. While imprisoned, the king poured his frustration and his sense of abandonment into verse, a genuine piece of royal songwriting, lamenting his captivity and the slowness of his subjects to ransom him. The teenage troubadour of the southern courts, all grown up and locked in a foreign fortress, reaching once more for music to give shape to his despair. The lion caged still sang. Now consider the staggering scale of the ransom, because it reveals just how valuable a king Richard was. Here is your anchor for it. The ransom demanded for Richard's release was an almost unimaginable sum, vastly more than the entire annual revenue of England, an amount so enormous that raising it required squeezing the kingdom dry through special taxes, seizures of treasure from churches, and contributions wrung from every corner of the realm. England, already drained by the fire sale that funded the Crusade, was now bled again to buy back its absent king. You feel the grim absurdity. The country that barely ever saw Richard had to nearly bankrupt itself twice over, first to send him to war and then to ransom him from the consequences of it. And here is where that watchful brother John finally shows his hand in full. With Richard imprisoned and the news spreading, John saw his chance and seized it, scheming openly with the King of France to keep Richard captive as long as possible, even reportedly offering to match or exceed the ransom if the Emperor would simply hold his brother indefinitely. You feel the venom of it. While the Lionheart's loyal supporters, including his indomitable old mother Eleanor, laboured desperately to raise the ransom and free him, his own brother was working just as hard to keep him locked away forever so that John could seize the crown for himself. The family that loves like a battlefield, true to form, right to the end. Historians still argue whether Richard's long captivity was an unmitigated disaster that humiliated England, drained its wealth, and nearly cost him his throne, or whether it ultimately strengthened his position by exposing John's treachery and rallying loyal subjects to the king's cause, demonstrating just how much his people were willing to sacrifice for him. Was the imprisonment a catastrophe, or a strange sort of vindication? You sense the answer depends entirely on how you weigh the cost against the loyalty it revealed, and the scholars, as ever, have never quite agreed. You watch the long months of captivity grind on the ransom, slowly gathered coin by painful coin, the indomitable Eleanor driving the effort with all her formidable will, and John's plots curdling in the background. At last, after more than a year in confinement, the staggering sum was paid, and Richard the Lionheart walked free, released back into a world that had nearly slipped from his grasp while he sat caged. And the king who emerged from that imprisonment was a furious one, his eyes blazing toward the brother who had betrayed him and the rival who had schemed against him, ready after everything to ride straight back into war. You watch the prison gates swing open at last, and the king who strides out into the daylight is not a man inclined to rest. After more than a year caged in foreign fortresses, after the staggering ransom bled from his kingdom, after the betrayal of his own brother, Richard the Lionheart emerges in the year 1194 with a fury banked in his chest and a very clear list of people he intends to deal with. Remember how I told you he only ever felt fully alive when there was a war to fight? Well, conveniently a war was waiting for him the moment he got home. You follow him first to England, where he lands to find his realm in disarray, his brother John having seized castles and stirred rebellion in his absence. And here you see one of the more telling moments of the whole saga, because Richard's confrontation with the treacherous John is almost anticlimactic in its mercy. You might expect the Lionheart to crush his scheming brother without pity, and yet by most accounts, when the two finally met, Richard forgave him. He is said to have dismissed John's treachery with a kind of weary contempt, treating his brother less as a dangerous rival and more as a foolish child led astray by bad company. You feel the strange mixture of magnanimity and disdain in it. The most fearsome warrior in Christendom, sparing the brother who tried to leave him rotting in a foreign cell because John was simply not worth the energy of true vengeance. But that mercy did not extend to the other architect of his misfortunes, the cunning King of France, and here Richard's real war waited. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight. After his release, Richard spent the final years of his life almost entirely in France, locked in a relentless military struggle to recover the territories that his brother and the French king had stripped away during his captivity and imprisonment. The crusade was over. Jerusalem was a closed chapter, and the last act of Richard's reign was a return to the very kind of conflict he had been waging since he was a teenage warlord in the southern sun, the grinding, ceaseless warfare over the lands of the Angevin Empire. You should understand that Richard, freed and furious, proved devastatingly effective in this final campaign. The military genius we saw at Acre and Arsuf was undimmed, and he set about clawing back his lost territories with relentless energy, winning battles, retaking fortresses, and steadily outmaneuvering his French rival, the King of France, who had schemed so confidently while Richard sat imprisoned, now found the Lionheart back in the saddle and as dangerous as ever, and the tide of the war turned steadily in Richard's favour. You watch him in his element once more, the restless king fully alive amid the clash of the campaign he was quite literally born for. And it was during these final years that Richard built what many consider his true masterpiece, a thing of stone rather than legend. Here is a quirky and genuinely impressive tidbit. Richard poured enormous resources and personal passion into constructing a magnificent fortress in Normandy called Chateau Gaillard, a castle so cleverly designed, so advanced in its defences, that it represented the cutting edge of military engineering for its age. He reportedly oversaw its construction with obsessive attention and pride, and when it was completed in astonishingly short time, he is said to have boasted of his beautiful castle, his fair daughter of 1 year, gazing upon it the way another man might gaze upon a beloved child. You find something revealing in that. The warrior who never settled, who fathered no legitimate heir, lavished a father's affection on a fortress. The castle was in a sense the truest offspring of his restless soul. You should appreciate just how much of Richard the man is captured in that castle. He had crossed the world for a holy city he could not hold, and now in the twilight of his reign he focused all that frustrated brilliance into a structure designed for the one thing he understood better than anyone alive: war. Chateau Gaillard was not a palace for comfort or a home for a family. It was a weapon made of stone, a declaration of dominance over the contested borderlands, the physical embodiment of a king who expressed his deepest passions not through love or peace but through the architecture of conflict. You walk its walls in your imagination and feel the personality of its maker in every cunning angle and overlapping defense. Historians still argue whether these final years of grinding warfare in France represented Richard at the height of his powers, a brilliant commander, methodically restoring his empire and proving himself the master of his rival, or whether they reveal the fundamental tragedy of the man, a king of immense gifts, who could do nothing with them but make war endlessly, until war was all his reign had ever amounted to. Was this a triumphant recovery, or simply more of the same restless violence that had consumed his entire life? You sense the question cuts to the very heart of who Richard was, a man so defined by conflict that even his successes were measured only in battles won and fortresses razed. You watch the campaign press on, Richard steadily recovering his lands, his French rival increasingly on the back foot, the magnificent castle rising over the river as a monument to his martial genius. After everything, the storms and the sieges and the captivity, the Lionheart seemed to be settling back into the one role he was ever truly comfortable in: the warrior king at the head of his army. Master of the battlefield feared across the whole of France. The crusade had ended in compromise, but here on home ground, against an old enemy, Richard appeared to be winning back everything he had lost. But you know, dear listener, because we have walked this entire restless life together, that Richard the Lionheart was never destined to die quietly in a comfortable bed, surrounded by grandchildren, his wars finally behind him. A man who spent his entire reign on the battlefield was always going to meet his end there, and his end, when it came, would arrive in the most ordinary and almost insultingly small way imaginable, at the foot of an unremarkable little castle, over a trivial dispute delivered by a single stray shot from an anonymous hand. The greatest warrior of his age was about to be undone by the smallest of wounds. You come now to the end of the road, to the small, almost insultingly ordinary place where the great Lionheart's restless life finally runs out. After everything, the storms and the sieges, the holy city and the captivity, the magnificent castle and the grinding French wars, Richard the Lionheart meets his death, not in some epic clash worthy of the legends, but at the foot of a minor, unremarkable little castle over a squabble so trivial it barely deserves the name. Remember how I told you a man who spent his whole reign on the battlefield was always going to die on one? Here at last is that ending, and it is both fitting and absurd in equal measure. You arrive in the spring of the year 1199 in a corner of Richard's French territories at a small castle called Chalus. The dispute that brought him there was the pettiest imaginable. Here is your mainstream fact for tonight. Richard laid siege to this minor castle over a quarrel involving a local lord and a reputed find of treasure, an utterly unremarkable affair that should have been beneath the notice of a king who had bested Saladin himself. The greatest warrior of his age reduced to besieging a backwater fortress over a squabble about buried gold. There is a dark comedy in it, the kind history seems to delight in. You watch Richard, ever the restless soldier, prowling around the castle walls one evening, surveying the defences with the casual confidence of a man who had broken sieges far mightier than this. The garrison was tiny, the danger seemingly negligible, and it was in this careless moment, this offhand stroll beneath the walls, that fate loosed its arrow. Here is the anchor of the whole tragic ending. A defender on the castle wall, armed with a crossbow, loosed a single bolt that struck Richard in the shoulder near the neck. a wound that seemed survivable at first, but that would through infection prove fatal within days. Now lean in for the quirky and rather poignant tidbit that the chroniclers cherished because the story of the shot itself became legend. It is said that the crossbowman who fired the fatal bolt was a young man in some tellings, barely more than a boy who had been shooting at the besiegers all day, and that Richard, ever the connoisseur of martial courage, had actually admired the defender's spirit, even applauding his shots before one of them found its mark. You feel the strange irony of it. The Lionheart, struck down by the very kind of bold defiance he had spent his whole life admiring, brought low by a humble crossbow, the weapon of the common soldier rather than the noble knight. The wound festered as wounds so often did in that age, before any understanding of infection, and Richard's mighty constitution could not save him. As the days passed and it became clear the king was dying, you witness one final act that captures everything noble and tragic about the man. There is a beloved story treasured by the chroniclers that the young crossbowman was captured, and that the dying Richard summoned him, and rather than condemning the boy who had killed him, the king forgave him, ordering that he be set free and even rewarded. You sit with that gesture for a moment, the wounded lion choosing mercy with his final breaths, pardoning the very hand that ended him. Historians still argue whether this act of deathbed clemency truly occurred, or was a beautiful legend grafted onto Richard's end, and whether, as some grimmer accounts insist, the boy was cruelly killed anyway after the king died against Richard's express wishes. The truth, like so much in this life, hovers forever between the noble legend and the harsh reality. And so, in early April of the year 1199, Richard I of England, the Lionheart, the warrior born to war, who had spent virtually his entire reign on the battlefield, died of a festering wound from a single crossbow bolt at a nothing little castle over a trivial dispute. He was around 41 years old. His formidable mother Eleanor, who had outlived so much, was reportedly at or near his side. At the end, the woman of the troubadour courts present for the death of the son she had shaped and championed across his whole turbulent life. The thread that began in that Oxford nursery with a queen and a squalling infant closes here with that same queen watching her warrior son slip away. You should know that Richard's body was divided in death, as was sometimes done for great rulers, his heart, his entrails, and his body buried in separate places across his domains. The lion-hearted king quite literally scattered across the lands he had fought over. There is a fitting strangeness to it. The man who never stayed in one place in life, the king who barely visited his own England, who roamed from the southern vineyards to the Holy Land to a French prison, was in death distributed across the very territories that had consumed him, restless even in his grave. And the brother, that watchful, scheming John, we have tracked all the way from his quiet beginnings. With Richard dead and childless, the crown passed to John, who would go on to become one of the most infamous and disastrous kings in English history, so unpopular that his reign helped provoke the great Charter of Liberties that would echo through the centuries. You feel the grim irony that the treacherous brother inherited everything the Lionheart had fought to hold and very nearly lost it all. But that, dear listener, is a story for another night. Historians still argue whether Richard the Lionheart was a heroic warrior king and one of the greatest soldiers of the medieval age, or a reckless absentee monarch who neglected his kingdom, drained its wealth, and accomplished little of lasting substance beyond his own dazzling legend. Was he England's lion-hearted hero, or a glory-chasing king who used his realm as a purse and died over a pile of treasure at a forgotten castle? Because Richard, magnificent and flawed, brave and ruthless, gifted and restless, was all of these things at once, a man too large and too contradictory to fit any single verdict. And now the war is finally over. The sieges have fallen silent. The great restless heart that could never sit still has at last come to rest. So let the scene begin to soften now, dear listener. Let the clash of arms fade gently into the distance, the crossbows and the castle walls dissolving into the gathering dark. Picture that turbulent sea Richard crossed so many times, growing calm and glassy beneath a quiet evening sky, the waves that once flung his fleet apart, now barely stirring, lapping softly against a darkened shore. Let the dust of the eastern roads settle. Let the banners of Acre and Arsuf droop and grow still in the windless night, The marching is done, the arrows have all fallen. The great deeds and the long quarrels, the family wars and the holy dreams, all of it belongs now to the deep and peaceful keeping of the past. Feel the centuries drift over the whole restless story like a soft and gentle snow. The very snow that a noble enemy once sent to cool a feverish king, settling now over everything, cooling it all into stillness. The Lionheart is at rest. Eleanor is at rest. Saladin, that worthy and chivalrous rival, is at rest. The vineyards of the south and the hills before Jerusalem lie quiet under the same dimming stars, and all the fierce and striving lives we walked beside tonight have long since laid down their burdens and grown still. There is nothing left now to fight for, nothing left to win, nothing left to do but breathe slowly and let go. And you here now in the soft and ordinary safety of your own bed, far from any battlefield, far from any storm-tossed sea, you have nowhere to march and nothing to guard. The world around you is quiet. The lights are low, the fan hums softly, and the long day is done. Let your shoulders sink. Let the whole weight of the waking world slip gently away. The stars are dimming. The great old story is at rest, and so now can you be. Close your eyes. The world is quiet. It is time at last for deep and peaceful sleep.